Hey everybody, and welcome back to Sip and Talk. All right, so you sent over some seriously interesting stuff for us to dig into today. And I gotta say, this one comment from one of our listeners was hilarious. Someone said that seeing Trump in the news is like more often than seeing your own dad. I mean, for some folks, that might actually be true, right? But joking aside, there's a pretty serious point underneath all that humor. One of your sources even calls it idolization culture.
That's a really great point. And you're right. That observation gets right to the heart of what we're going to be talking about today. It seems like you've got some really interesting material here that tackles this whole idea from different perspectives. There's that economics piece about Trump's hiring practices, and then you've got some more detailed analyses of the U.S.-China trade war and this broader concept of idolization.
Yeah, exactly. So our mission today, as we unpack all this stuff you've sent us, is to try to understand this whole idolization thing. And we're going to do that by focusing on two main areas that really stood out from what you highlighted. First up, we're going to dive into what's happening with China in the middle of all this U.S.-China trade drama. Can they find allies to counter the U.S.? Who are their potential friends in this? And how do they even end up in this position? Is there a way out for them, or are they stuck?
Right. And then for the second part of our conversation, we're going to focus on the language coming from Trump's team. You know, all those phrases like, only President Trump can do this. We need to think about whether this is just regular run-of-the-mill enthusiastic support or if there's something more to it. Is Trump actually promoting a kind of cult of personality? Can we compare what's happening to what we see in authoritarian countries? And what are the potential downsides of this kind of talk?
Okay, so let's jump right in and start with China. It feels like we've been talking about U.S.-China trade forever. And your sources paint a really complicated picture of the global landscape. If we're looking at China's position, the biggest question is who's got their back? Who are their allies?
It's really fascinating how your analysis breaks down China's potential partnerships. An obvious one is Russia, right? Their relationship has been getting warmer, and they're cooperating on things like energy, military stuff, and global politics. You see them often voting together in the UN Security Council, and they keep talking about this comprehensive strategic partnership. But like your source points out, there are some limits to that relationship. Russia is really dependent on China economically, and they could potentially be rivals for influence in Central Asia in the future.
So it's not exactly a rock-solid alliance.
Exactly.
Okay, what about Pakistan? They seem to have a pretty close relationship with China.
Totally. That all-weather strategic cooperative partnership is a big thing, especially when you consider the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, that's CPEC. Pakistan is really important for China geopolitically to counter India's influence and to secure access to the Indian Ocean. But Pakistan has its own economic problems and security issues, which could limit how much support they can actually provide on the world stage.
That makes sense. Now, North Korea, they're always in the news, and China's usually involved somehow. What's their relationship like?
Well, China is definitely a major economic and political backer for North Korea, and historically they've tried to play the mediator role on the Korean Peninsula. But there are some big ifs and buts here. North Korea's, let's just call it unpredictability, their reliance on China for basically everything, and the whole nuclear weapons issue, all that makes it a very complicated relationship.
So again, close ties, but with some complications. What about other parts of the world? Your analysis mentioned Southeast Asia, Central Asia, and Africa.
Yeah, and that's largely driven by China's Belt and Road Initiative, which has created some pretty significant economic ties with countries like Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar in Southeast Asia, Kazakhstan in Central Asia, and even Ethiopia and Kenya in Africa. They definitely get a lot of investment and loans from China. But the analysis you provided suggests that when it comes to picking a side between the U.S. and China, they prefer to stay neutral.
Yeah, playing it safe, right? Trying to be friends with everyone.
Exactly. They're just looking out for their own interests, which is understandable.
Got to look out for number one. Your analysis also mentions Iran. What's happening there?
The big connection there is their shared distrust of the U.S. and their energy trade. With all the U.S. sanctions, Iran sees China as a really crucial alternative market for their oil. But Iran is pretty isolated internationally, and they've got their own internal problems. That means they're not likely to be a major player as an ally for China globally.
And lastly, what about this idea of the global south? China's been trying to rally developing countries together. Are they having any luck?
China has been pushing hard to position itself as a leader for the developing world, trying to unite them against what they see as Western dominance. They're using platforms like BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SQ. But your analysis makes a good point. There isn't really a unified position among these countries. A lot of them also prefer to keep a balance between the U.S. and China. They're trying to get the best of both worlds.
So China's got some partners, but maybe not a tight-knit group of powerful allies who are all against the U.S. That leads to another question. How did China find themselves in this position where they seem kind of isolated in the face of all this trade tension?
This is where it gets really interesting. Your analysis offers a few possible explanations. One is that China might have misjudged the global situation. Maybe they overestimated how much other countries disliked the U.S. and underestimated how concerned those countries were about China's growing economic clout and geopolitical moves. The European Union is a great example. They're increasingly worried about trade with China and have been critical of China's practices. Maybe China thought more countries would automatically be on their side because they were frustrated with the U.S.
Yeah, maybe. Another factor could be what your analysis calls the Trump negotiation tactic. It's this idea that the U.S. might have been using a bit of psychological warfare to make China feel like they were alone, while at the same time working to strengthen its own alliances. Think about the updated USMCA agreement. That's the trade deal between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada, or the QED, the security dialogue between the U.S., Japan, India, and Australia.
That's a smart strategy, making China feel isolated while strengthening your own position with key partners. And the third point your analysis brings up is China's own strategic passivity. What does that actually mean in this situation?
Basically, the analysis points out that China has some economic weaknesses because they're pretty dependent on the U.S. market, especially for their exports. And some of China's bolder diplomatic moves in recent years, like how they've dealt with Canada and Australia, might have actually made other countries more hesitant to get too cozy with them.
So playing hardball might have backfired a bit when it came to making friends. All this paints a pretty tough picture for China. Your analysis even asks, "Sifa," which essentially means, is it hard for them to back down or de-escalate?
Right, that's the million-dollar question. What started as a trade war has ballooned into something much bigger. Now it involves technology, global politics, and even ideology. De-escalation is a serious challenge for China. Not having as many solid allies as the U.S.-led system is a huge problem. There's a real risk of them becoming even more isolated globally, especially with things like the Indo-Pacific strategy gaining momentum and the EU scrutinizing Chinese investments. Plus, there are all the economic pressures they're facing back home.
It's not just about tariffs anymore. It's a whole web of interconnected issues. So yeah, finding a way to de-escalate is going to be a really tough task for China.
Yeah, no kidding. Okay, let's shift gears now and focus on the second thing you wanted to talk about, President Trump and this whole idolization culture.
This is a fascinating topic, and to be honest, a bit worrisome when you really start digging into it. Your sources use this term, "thkur." You asked earlier what it meant, and it basically translates to God-making or idolization, which is the process of making someone seem bigger than life through excessive praise and myth-making. And it got me thinking about some of the things we've been hearing from Trump's inner circle over the years.
Yeah, your analysis has some really striking examples of what you call incessant praise. You even asked if it's neya. Basically, if it's too much or too enthusiastic, and shike. What are some of those commonly heard, overly enthusiastic phrases? And man, the examples you give are kind of over the top. Things like, only President Trump can do this. And they say that about everything, trade deals, meeting with Kim Jong-un, even the way they handled COVID.
Exactly. And it seems like we hear it constantly. President Trump has shown unprecedented leadership. Or, if it weren't for President Trump, America wouldn't be this strong today. It's almost like a mantra, right? And according to your sources, the praise gets even more intense. Stuff like, this is President Trump's wise strategy. No one else can see this far. Or, there has never been a president like President Trump in American history. They even compare him to the founding fathers, like President Trump is a combination of Washington and Lincoln. It's just a lot.
It really is. So what do you think is driving all this constant, almost unbelievable praise coming from his team?
Well, your analysis points to a few things. One is that it clearly strengthens the leader's image and creates this intense loyalty among supporters. It builds this idea that he's the only one who can solve problems. Another reason could be that it grabs media attention and keeps Trump and his agenda front and center. And of course, Trump himself has always made it clear that he expects total loyalty.
Right. That seems to be a top priority for him. But what are some of the potential downsides of this kind of atmosphere where praise is the dominant language? Well, Your analysis highlights a few issues. A big one is that people might stop being objective and giving honest feedback, which is a recipe for bad decisions. If everyone is just agreeing with the boss and telling him how great he is, who's going to speak up when things are going wrong? That creates an echo chamber where you don't get diverse opinions, which can lead to bad strategies. And then there's the risk of the public becoming disillusioned and seeing it as a culture of flattery or even a cult of personality situation, which erodes trust in the whole system.
That's a crucial point, and it leads right into that question you had. Is Trump encouraging a cult of personality? In Chinese, that would be middle. Does Trump admire this culture of idol-making? Is it similar to the kind of personal worship you see in authoritarian states? And what are some of the concerns about that for?
It makes you wonder, right? Your analysis makes a strong case that Trump might be leaning towards this cult of personality vibe. Just think about how much he promotes himself, always saying he's special with lines like "only I can fix it" and that he's the most successful president ever.
And those rallies he holds are like massive spectacles. They're almost like rock concerts with specific music, the chants like "lock her up" and the MAGA hats. It all feels very symbolic and ritualistic.
Yeah, and the intense loyalty within the MAGA movement, where he's often portrayed as this savior fighting a deep state, and how he demands total loyalty within the Republican Party, even branding those who disagree with him as rhinos. It all contributes to this picture. And the way he communicates directly with his base through social media, now Truth Social, bypassing traditional media channels, it's reminiscent of how some historical figures built those direct personal connections. And we can't forget how sensitive he is to any criticism, always attacking the media and critics as fake news or enemies of the people.
That article about his hiring practices is really eye-opening too. Asking people who they think won the 2020 election in job interviews, that seems less about their qualifications and more about gauging their loyalty. And background checks to see if they've criticized his views in the past. That's pretty extreme vetting.
Yeah, loyalty seems to be the ultimate litmus test. But your analysis also presents some counter-arguments, suggesting that maybe Trump's behavior is more about branding than a full-blown cult of personality. He comes from the world of business and reality TV, where branding is everything. Remember all those buildings and products with his name plastered on them?
That's a good point. He's been building this Trump brand for decades. And unlike in authoritarian regimes like those led by Mao or the Kim dynasty, where cult building is systematic and state-controlled, Trump doesn't have that level of power here. We still have a relatively free press and an independent judiciary. Plus, the people who support him have a wide range of reasons for doing so. It's not just blind devotion. And his communication style, while definitely over the top, seems more geared towards attracting attention than crafting this image of mystery and infallibility.
So it might be a mix of ego, branding, and genuine support, rather than a top-down manufactured cult. But even if it's not a full-blown cult of personality, the analysis does raise some concerns about Trump's apparent extreme narcissism. What are some of the potential dangers of that?
Even if it doesn't reach the level of a formal cult, having a leader with such extreme narcissism can lead to some pretty serious problems. It can result in biased and risky decision-making, where they might disregard different opinions or expert advice. The early response to COVID is a good example. It can also strain relationships, as we've seen with the high turnover in his cabinet and the public feuds he's had with allies. It can exacerbate social divisions with his divisive rhetoric, and it can even undermine democratic institutions, like with the refusal to concede the 2020 election and the promotion of election fraud conspiracies. And in the long run, it could damage his legacy, potentially shifting public perception from admiration to seeing him as arrogant and out of touch.
Those are some really serious potential consequences. And your analysis specifically mentioned the parallels to idolization in authoritarian regimes.
Yep.
Are there any clear connections we can draw?
Definitely. The analysis brings up Mao Zedong's God-making movement in China during the 1960s as a prime example. The crucial role that Lin Biao played in kicking it off, the widespread distribution of the Little Red Book, and the power shift from the Communist Party to Mao himself, those are definite parallels. This involved massive propaganda campaigns, suppressing any form of dissent and constructing this image of Mao as this infallible, supreme leader. One of your sources even stressed the importance of critical thinking in this context, highlighting the need to analyze information and question sources, which is, of course, the opposite of what happens in a cult of personality.
So even though the U.S. system might prevent a full-blown, state-controlled cult like what happened with Mao, we are seeing some similar patterns in how a leader can be elevated to this almost untouchable status through constant praise and by silencing any dissent within their own circle.
That's an important distinction to make. The methods might differ, but that underlying desire for a leader to be seen as perfect and the culture of intense loyalty that surrounds them, those share some striking similarities.
Well, this has been a really in-depth look at some complicated stuff. We started with China's difficult situation with the U.S. trade war and who their potential allies might be. Then we went deep into this fascinating and slightly unnerving idea of an idolization culture around political leaders, particularly with Trump.
And as we talked about, these two things that might seem separate, U.S.-China trade and the way we talk about political leaders, they're actually connected by these bigger trends in how countries project their interests and how leaders shape their public image. And as always, we've just tried to present the information from your sources in a neutral way without taking sides.
So as you continue thinking about all this, here's a final thought for you. In today's world where we're constantly bombarded with information from all sides, how can we all improve our critical thinking skills so we can better navigate all these narratives about leadership and national interest? It feels more important than ever to be able to really analyze and question what we're being told.
That's a really crucial question, and it's something we all need to keep working on. These are complex issues with no easy answers, and we encourage you to keep exploring them. Keep an open mind, be willing to see different perspectives, and never stop questioning.
And on a lighter note, a quick shout out to our friend Micky and his YouTube channel, Mickytolife. If you're into travel vlogs, fun unboxings of whiskey and other cool drinks, and some chill background music, you should definitely check it out. We try to give him a plug whenever we can. I think we're basically his entire marketing team at this point. All right, that's all the time we have for today. Until next time.